Next, from Springfield, we speak one-on-one with Jim Nowlan of the University of Illinois' IGPA. Mr. Nowlan has spent over 40 years in and around the highest levels of Illinois government and is now leading an effort to raise ethical standards and the level of integrity for those who serve in Illinois government. This runs about 25 minutes. Jim Nowlan, you're now with the University of Illinois' IGPA, and the title is Senior Fellow, but a lot of people, I think, who have watched Illinois politics over the years know you for a variety of other positions that you've held. For those who are not familiar who you are, just give us a thumbnail. What is your background?
Okay, first I'd note that Senior Fellow is a euphemism for old, and so I can go back quite a ways in terms of activities in the past. I was a state legislator when I was in my mid-20s to about 30 years of age, when I ran for lieutenant governor with Governor Dick Ogilvy's blessing and became his nominee for lieutenant governor in a race which we lost narrowly to Dan Walker and Neil Hartigan.
Let me bring you up. The thing is, now you're with the university, you've also done publishing, and the long and short of it is you've been around government in Illinois for the last 35 or nearly 40 years, I guess now.
Whenever
actually, it's hard to believe that 1972 was 40 years ago, isn't it?
Whenever I'm kicked out of government and politics, I take refuge at the Institute of Government and Public Affairs, or IGPA as it's referred to, and that's where I am at the moment.
And you bring, as you just laid out, a wealth of knowledge over 40 years from having worked closely with the highest levels of government and knowing the governors firsthand. Today we're talking because you are part of a program you're calling the Illinois Integrity Initiative. Tell us, first of all, what that is and why are you involved in it?
Former Governor Jim Edgar thought that the Institute of Government, IGPA, where he's a distinguished senior fellow, should be involved.
I guess that means you're not distinguished.
I'm undistinguished. Should be involved in the topic of corruption in Illinois and what to do about it. And I signed on quickly to be a part of this initiative. And so we are in this first year exploring how much corruption there is in the state of Illinois to have a kind of baseline. Many people muse that we may be the most corrupt state in the nation. Well, are we? And my colleague Dick Simpson at the University of Illinois at Chicago and I did some research that shows Illinois ranks very high, and we can talk about that later. But back to the Illinois Integrity Initiative, we're exploring whether you can change a political culture that might be called a culture of corruption, and how to change such a culture of corruption if we conclude that one exists in Illinois. So in a couple of weeks, I'm going to host a symposium in Chicago that will look at the topic of does Illinois have a culture of corruption? If so, and we shouldn't conclude that it does, but if so, can a culture of corruption be changed? And how long would it take? And then third, how can you go about changing a culture of corruption? And we don't have any brilliant answers at the moment, but that's what we're exploring, and we've done some polling that gives us a sense of what people in Illinois think about the topic.
Well, let's start with that.
Okay.
What do you find? I would say that there's clearly a culture of corruption in the state of Illinois, and it's not just with the Rod Blagojeviches of the world. We all know the governors, but when you just look throughout the many decades, and what we see were the different press investigations of shenanigans going on, whether it's in any number of agencies in state government or city government. There seems to be in the state of Illinois far more willingness to cut corners and do things that, as you say, you wouldn't want to have on the front page of the newspaper, but people engage in these practices anyway. But what did you find? I mean, that's me editorial, I suppose, having covered Illinois politics for some years now.
Well, Dick Simpson and I found that Illinois ranks second or third in the nation in terms of public convictions for public corruption based on data generated by the U.S. Department of Justice in its annual report on how many convictions for public corruption there were across the 94 district courts that make up the U.S. Department of Justice. And Illinois, when you make it proportional to population, comes in second after Louisiana and the District of Columbia, which you can consider to be a state or not, but Illinois comes in after Louisiana.
Let me ask if I might. Yeah. When you did this research, how far back did you go? I mean, I don't think any of us are interested in what happened under Big Bill Thompson back in the 20s or something. Were you looking?
We went back to 76.
76, okay.
Yeah,
so
in fact, that's the year that the U.S. Department of Justice started compiling statistics on convictions for public corruption. And so we have about, what would that be, 35 years of data. And it's not a perfect data set. We don't cover, for example, legal corruption. And we know there's a lot of that that goes on in states such as Illinois. You and I were talking the other day about what I would call the legal corruption of pension scams, in which people take advantage of the state pension system by doubling their pension based on a month's work in an office at an inflated salary.
The Tribune did that story. A former lawmaker went in and did a story and got paid $12,000 or a report, and allegedly it was kind of the information that could have been found on any website, and that it was kind of a gimmick to double his salary. I was going to bring that up. That's not technically illegal.
No.
It may be immoral. So how do we define what is corruption?
I define corruption simply as a personal gain at public expense. And clearly the pension illustration is that significant personal gain, maybe up to $3 million in extra pension benefits, depending upon the lifespan of this person who took advantage of the pension system. And so that's corruption, but we were only able to measure formal illegal corruption based on convictions by the federal courts.
I can understand as a researcher you don't want to presume your conclusions and you want to verify it. On the other hand, I would say, as we already laid out, you've been around Illinois politics for 40 years. You've seen good governors and you've seen some not so good governors and others who serve in government. Why is there that public perception across the nation of Illinois being corrupt in your estimation?
I think because there has developed an Illinois way of doing things, and the Illinois way is one in which it's perceived by the common citizen that everybody else is taking advantage of government when he can, and therefore, if I don't, I will be seen as the fool for not doing what everybody else is doing.
I look at corruption. I mean, I think of it in terms certainly in relative to the government action, and whether you're an appointed official or an elected official, if you're skewing the system, as you said earlier, for personal gain, that's certainly, I think, in the public mind, what we're talking about as far as corruption. And in Illinois, you have not only the governors, which are the famous cases, but we had under George Ryan some of his aides that were going to prison, that they were, and certainly under Governor Blagojevich's administration, you had others who were twisting arms and threatening people that they were going to pull their grants if they didn't donate to the campaign.
Right.
When you worked with three governors, and you worked with Governor Ogilvie, Governor Thompson, and Governor Edgar, was it different? And if so, how was it different under their administrations?
I think that they were honest men, and yet I think even they participated not in direct corrupt acts, but in acts that represent private gain at public expense in terms of taking large contributions and maybe providing highway contracts for those who provided the large contributions and fewer contracts for others, because that's the way the game was played in order to generate the campaign funds needed for the next election. And so, while I consider them good men and honest men, I think the system in this illustration kind of suggests that even good men can end up participating in actions that aren't wholly ethical in terms of my definition of corruption, which is private gain at public expense.
What, for the viewers who are watching this, and I think a lot of people, I don't know if they're just so frustrated or beaten down that they just kind of shrug their shoulders and we've become too accustomed to it. Abner Mikva, the former federal judge and former White House counsel and congressman, gave a speech about 10 years ago at the University of Illinois Springfield, and he said, Illinois citizens seem to have a perverse pride in the corruption of Illinois, and they point over the years to Al Capone and the different governors that go to jail. What should citizens, what should they be doing? How do we change this culture?
I took a poll of Illinois citizens, and 90% of the 1,200 respondents said that they thought the state was somewhat or strongly corrupted. And then I asked them what could be done about it. 3 out of 4 of the respondents said reduce the role of money in politics, which now is becoming difficult because of U.S. Supreme Court decisions that prohibit bans or limits on contributions made by wealthy people and corporations and unions to political action committees. So beyond that, I continued to ask them what could be done, and 2 out of 3 said that ethics education in our schools would be a way of reducing over time corruption in the state of Illinois, and others thought that public education campaigns outside of school to arouse the consciousness of the electorate to ethical issues would be valuable. I don't know that I...
Can I throw out some other examples? It seems to me a couple things that are clear, and they're ironic. The news media holds itself up as a good thing, and that we go out and cover politics and try to give access and do investigations, and we are the watchdogs, allegedly. The irony, I find, is that the politicians are being driven to raise vast sums of money to get their message out on commercial TV. Mm-hmm. And so the very people, the news organizations who have free licenses will charge confiscatory prices to get a candidate's message out to the people. So to some extent, maybe they're part of the problem. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We've often heard the argument of term limits. We have people who go back to almost the Ogilvy administration. I don't want to be naming names right now, but a recent individual was just convicted and was a power broker through Republican or Democratic administrations. It seems to me that when you have different people in power for such a long time, they tend to gain an attitude that it's their government, mm-hmm. not the people's government. They run it. They make their living doing it. They make the decisions. Just as I'm running a small grocery store or something, they tend to think of it as they own it and take umbrage about outsiders, meaning the people or reformers coming in, and it's an attitudinal change. Should term limits, maybe it's not a perfect solution. I mean, is term limits something that you, as the Integrity Initiative, would look at? Those kind of things, the laws. I'm just kind of more specifically thinking, what are the nuts and bolts of reform that would be even looked at to change? You know, and lastly, I look at the Republicans for years had a lock on Chicago politics and there was corruption. Now the Democratic Party has had a lock for the last almost 60 years on Democratic politics in Chicago. There's never any mayor running for mayor of Chicago on the Democratic side who's ever honestly challenged by a Republican. To what extent should we blame the people of Illinois for just going along with the power grid that is in existence?
Well, I think we can all be blamed. In terms of looking at specific nuts and bolts kinds of actions, I think term limits provides an element of possibility. I, at this moment, can see pluses and minuses in term limits, but clearly it would flush the system regularly, and there would thus not be the situation in which people could believe it's their government and take umbrage, as you say, when others try to direct the operations of their government. Pat Quinn, the present governor, has just come out with a proposal that I haven't read thoroughly, but it would allow for the initiative to change Illinois laws, and I think local laws related to ethics in government.
He wants a constitutional amendment that would allow people to have an initiative that would also allow them to remove people from office, as I understand it. Part of what it would do. I think it would do more than that.
Right, but in addition to recall, I think the so-called Lincoln Amendment would allow for public petition to put on the ballot questions of of laws that would ostensibly rein in government corruption. So that may be another nuts and bolts piece. For example, we really don't have a code of ethics in state government, even though most professions certainly have codes of ethics. The legislature has a series of ethical statements, but they made sure that they were advisory only. They're not binding on the members of the legislature. So maybe Quinn's proposal is one that would arouse people to be thinking about ways in which to curb corruption among the public officials. But it may go beyond nuts and bolts kinds of things, and maybe I'm being too grand when I talk about changing the culture of corruption, but I think that may be what will be required ultimately to reduce corruption in our public life. I think there's a different attitude in Iowa toward the role of public service than there is in Illinois. There's less of this sense that we can take advantage of government. We can do well instead of doing good in our government. And so how can we do that? As I say, I don't know yet, and it would take years to do it, but I think education in the public schools is one route to changed behavior. And it's the kind of thing we're going to be talking about at the symposium I referred to earlier on Can a Culture of Corruption Be Changed?
There's a lot here to talk about. First of all, one thing, I don't know if you have do you have a website as yet, or do you plan to have a website? And what I'm getting at is I wonder to what extent the citizenry who would watch this interview, would watch some of the coverage Illinois Channel will do of your future events, how can they get involved or give you feedback?
That's a good question, and at this stage they could go to the Institute of Government, the Institute of Government and Public Affairs website at the University of Illinois, and communicate with me. I don't have it set up for that purpose as of this moment, but will do so. And it's a great suggestion. As I mentioned, this initiative is very new, and we're simply exploring right now, but there will be ways the public can communicate with me and Governor Edgar.
Who all else would you, well, first of all, let's talk, you're going to have an event coming up in Chicago that the Illinois Channel will look to cover. Let's talk a little bit about that, and then throughout the course of the year, if you have any other events, how will you go about doing the research, communicating your initiative to the citizens?
Well, we have a small budget right now and hope to expand that through support from charitable foundations. But I have a couple of research assistants, and Dick Simpson has research assistants, and we will decide how to apply ourselves in the coming year. So I don't have any specific research initiative for you, although Dick Simpson wants to come up with a measure of the costs of corruption. He believes that the costs of corruption to the taxpayer are hidden and that they're very significant. And so we will try to measure the costs of corruption as a way of keeping the issue before the public, because I really think that it's a matter that much of our corruption is based in large part on simply not thinking about one's actions, or justifying them too easily without realizing that there is a moral and an ethical component to decisions related to government decisions. And so if we can increase the consciousness of the Illinois citizenry about the importance of thinking about ethical issues, I think we can over time make the decision makers more sensitive to the right and wrong of decisions. For example, when I was a young legislator, a fellow freshman legislator, George O'Brien, later a congressman, now deceased, sent copies of A Man for All Seasons to all of the fellow freshman legislators about Henry VIII and Sir Thomas More, who lost his head for his conviction, his principle that there should not be a divorce granted. And I wondered as I was reading this as a young legislator what it had to do with the legislative service. And then it struck me that it's about principle. It's about right and wrong. And it had a dramatic impact on me. So, because I hadn't given a thought to right or wrong before that time. And I could have easily gone along with the way things were done in the legislature in the 1960s, when often bills were slipped into pockets in return for a good vote in committee. And yet the illustration of consciousness raising made a big difference in my life. And I think, for example, the initiative will be doing ethics training at new member conferences coming up after the election of a new set of legislators. We'll be participating in the new members conference, and we'll have an element on ethics there.
Let me, before we have to close out, we're going to have to close out shortly here. You know, and we talked about this, I just look growing up, I was born in the 50s, growing up in the 60s, it was not uncommon, certainly in the early 60s, and in the South, probably going through the 70s, to use the N-word. Mm-hmm. And we changed that societally. It was no longer acceptable to do that. The attitude of cigarettes has been demonized, and it's not a good thing for you, right. So we changed that.
Drunk driving is another
Drunk
one.
driving, you look back when Dean Martin in the 60s had the show, and he was always, we would laugh about him being half-crocked.
Right.
There was a comedian, Foster Brooks, who used to get up and his whole act was acting drunk.
Yeah.
That would never go today.
Yeah.
Because of what Mothers Against Drunk Driving finally got so outraged that they raised the level of outrage within society by saying this isn't funny. This has real-world consequences.
Yeah.
People are dying. My I guess editorializing here would be that within this, in the state of Illinois, you need to have the same kind of thing. The level of corruption that's been going on, that people just shrug their shoulders and say it's just always been this way, has to stop. And that if I were running a business and someone's, you know, it's between going to Wisconsin or Illinois or, you know, Tennessee, I think I would really ask myself, why do I want to go to a state where more than likely I'm going to have the inspectors coming in and they may be asking me for some payoff so I don't find 100 faults in the building that they want to move into.
Well, that's a good point. There are costs of corruption, and it's bad for business. I did a poll of 70 economic development professionals. Those are fellows and ladies who go out and recruit businesses and jobs to their communities. And more than, I think it was almost 70% of those I surveyed said that corruption is a negative factor from time to time, or a serious negative factor frequently, in their efforts to recruit businesses, which follows along with what you're saying. One of the respondents said too often the conversation with an out-of-state CEO who's in the state to look for a location begins with him saying, well, do I have to make a campaign contribution to do business in Illinois? And he said, that's said jocularly, but it sets the wrong tone for the discussion.
Well, and look, I looked at a number of corporations. I mean, at the federal level, the same kind of thing. I think Illinois certainly has a reputation of being more corrupt that it's earned over the years. But you know, I think a lot of businesses feel that they have to pay dues to who's ever in power just so that they are not taken advantage of, or that there's not retribution. So you have some businesses, the defense contractors, let's say, that might gravitate more to the Republican viewpoint, let's say for the sake of discussion, of being more pro-defense. But we see it all the time in research. If whatever party's in power, the defense contractors, any other corporation, they're going to give more of their money to the party in power.
Right.
And it's not because necessarily has nothing to do with the governing philosophy. It's a defensive measure so that they're buying themselves protection against having some bill that's going to hurt them.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I know that that happens, or has happened, in state government as well. I remember years ago a civil engineer came to me and said, Jim, I need your counsel. I've been submitting bids to the state of Illinois for work, and I am not getting any business, and my bids are very tight, and I know they're good bids. I said, maybe being a part of the system, I said, well, I have heard that if you made a major campaign contribution to somebody in the Department of Transportation, that you might get some business. And 6 months later he came to me and said, you know, I've been getting all sorts of business with the state since I made that campaign contribution. So money buys access and favoritism. But getting back to your point about outrage, I think that's what has to develop. And if I don't sound outraged myself, it's because in this first year we're trying to be somewhat analytical about how do we spark that outrage. I think it simmers under the surface and could be sparked into a flame, and that's the kind of thing we're trying to figure out how to do.
I don't know. I mean, sometimes it's, you know, and again, I try not to editorialize too much. I've been editorializing a bit, but, you know, I don't have to, Theodore Roosevelt, I think it was, once said, when it comes to being fair, I don't have to be fair between the fire and the firemen. And to that end, the Illinois Channel is fair and balanced, but we don't endorse corruption in any of its forms. And to the extent that it happens, and I think there ought to be a great deal of outrage. I want to note before we close out, because we've been talking about corruption in government in any number of forms. I've been in government for years. You've known people in and out of government. Just because you've been in government for a long time doesn't mean you're corrupt. Paul Simon was in, no one ever had any saying that, to my knowledge, that he was corrupt in any way.
Paul Douglas.
I mean, there's been some real giants in Illinois over the years. And just talk for a minute, with your experience as an insider who's worked in and out of government, I presume you would say the vast majority of people, both elected and unelected, who work in Illinois government are good, honest people.
I believe that, and yet at the same time, I believe that since 1976, 1,828, that's 1,828 Illinoisans have been convicted of public corruption. And many of those people are people whom we probably considered honest before they fell into whatever decisions or activities that caused them to be convicted. So it's an interesting social dynamic, and so I think even a person who enters politics honestly can sometimes fall prey to making corrupt decisions, maybe for having been in office too long and considering government his or her own fiefdom, or for whatever reasons. So it isn't a simple issue of, is there a small subset of people who are corrupt going in and nobody else is. I think instead it's often failure to think about the consequences and the ethical issues related to one's decisions that causes one to become corrupt. And I think the Illinois system, the Illinois way, kind of lends itself to falling prey to making corrupt decisions.
Well, Jim Nowlan, we already gone longer, but it's an important topic, and we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Terry.
Thank you. You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.